Hand over every company item, human resources said, voices flat and rehearsed, and I set the heavy keyring down like it was the last coin in my pocket. I'm a man plain and simple, and I let my fingertips linger on that metal longer than they expected. They never saw the small satisfaction that settled behind my ribs. They didn't see I had already decided what would happen next, or that patience had done most of the work for me. I walked out of the conference room with nothing but that keyring and a calm I had taught myself to wear like a coat. HR walked me past his glass office as if escorting a criminal, and Mark, the CEO, pretended he was too busy to look up. I felt everyone's eyes on us on my back, but I carried that attention like a quiet tide. I didn't rush to my car. I eased into the driver's seat, thumbed the edge of the keyring, and called the one person who always handled the building's mess. The property manager who had tolerated late checks and empty promises for years. I reminded her of the months Mark had painted over problems and left bills to pile. I told her about the deferred maintenance, the missed payments, the quiet patches I'd made so meetings could continue on schedule. She listened without sympathy. "We've been patient," she said. "We can't be patient forever." The eviction paperwork was drafted that afternoon, recorded like a cold fact. I told her to post the notice the minute HR walked me out. Timing, I thought, should feel like destiny. A few hours later, my phone lit up. Mark's voice came through like someone had thrown a glass against the wall. "Why is there an eviction notice taped to my door?" he shouted. The calm mask he always wore cracked into panic. He sounded smaller than I remembered. I listened while he unraveled, counting his breaths, measuring his words. For the first time in months, I felt nothing but a cold, clean calm. I didn't roar or shove. I let the silence do the heavy lifting. "You told me to handle it," he said, voice pitched high with blame. "You were our operations guy. How could you?" He stopped himself. He tried to reach for the old script, confusion, deflection, charm. It didn't fit anymore. "You knew the lease," I said. My voice was even, practiced by nights I spent rehearsing what I would say and what I would not. "You signed the checks you wanted to delay. You signed the vendors you wanted quiet. I kept the house from burning while you sold the dream." "That's not how," he barked, but then his words thinned into something more dangerous, more childish. "You sabotaged me." He needed a target he could point to, someone to call a villain. "No," I told him, "you did that. I just stopped pretending a few things were fine." I could hear the board murmuring in the background, his staff whispering like a pack feeling the first thunder. I let him imagine their faces. I let him taste the exposure he had hidden from. He tried bargaining. "We can fix this. I can call them. You don't have to." He always thought he could make people move. He used to turn lawyers into poets and investors into believers. The arrogance of that man had been a currency for years. Now that currency had a paper trail and signatures and missed deadlines. It bled out in a way charisma couldn't cover. "You could have fixed it months ago," I said. "You chose not to. You preferred to use people's patience instead of taking responsibility." There was a pause, a soft, furious silence that said more than any of his pleas. I watched the office through his glass as his empire shrank into a hallway argument, staff leaning in doorways with their phones out, and faces lifted to read the notice the property manager had taped to his door. He begged, he threatened. He tried to charm me with old jokes that used to make me laugh and now sounded thin as paper. I let him try. Every tactic folded under the weight of facts I had gathered, the leases, the missed payments, vendor notes that showed who had been covering for whom. I had kept the receipts, the emails, the quiet memos that proved the hand that fed the company was mine more than his. I had not come to burn him down. I came to stop being his scaffolding. When the call ended, he hung up like a man who had been unmasked in front of his guests. I sat there a long time, the car humming, the city moving around me like it had always moved. People say revenge is hollow. Maybe for some it is. For me, it felt like clearing a throat so the truth could be heard. For years, I had been asking for fair payment in whispers and polite emails. I had been answering late-night calls and stamping my name where his ego had left blank lines. The eviction notice was not a strike. It was a mirror placed where he could not walk away from his reflection. Friends ask if I don't feel guilty if I sleep at night. I sleep because I am not the kind of man who props up another's lies out of pity or fear. I planned, yes, and I waited. I cataloged and timed and let paperwork do what words couldn't. When the walls came down, they didn't fall because I pushed them. They fell because there was nothing solid under them anymore. And when the rubble landed, I made sure he was standing where the last beam would take him full on. I remember meeting Mark the way people remember the first shot of adrenaline, sharp, convincing, and something you never forget once it hits you. He stood in the foyer like he owned the future, and when he smiled, investors leaned forward like they'd been paid to listen. I'm a man who notices that kind of thing. I noticed how people stopped looking for small mistakes whenever he talked. He had an easy line for everything, and he dangled a partnership like it was the natural next step for anyone who stuck around. "Stick with me," he told me on day one, like a promise and an order all at once. "You work hard, we grow together." I took that seriously. I was raised to believe loyalty mattered, that when you put your back into something, you earned a place at the table. So I stayed late, I took calls at midnight, I handled crises that never made their way up to him. I learned how the printers jammed, which vendors would cut a price if they were paid on time, and which clients needed to be walked through a problem on a Sunday. There were nights when I sat alone under the office lights, fixing spreadsheets and drafting proposals, listening to his laugh from a closed-door party and thinking, this is the cost of getting there. He rewarded me with praise in public and vague promises in private. We'll get you equity, he'd say, clapping my shoulder as if that made it real. Your family here. Those words sounded good. I wanted them to be true, so I believed them. I kept records not because I mistrusted him then, but because I wanted to be ready when the chance came. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. The truth is, trust isn't blind in business. You earn it and you test it, and sometimes you keep it because it works. For a long time, my tests came back fine. Clients signed, deals closed, the company grew, and my hands were on the gears that made it run. But cracks started to show in ways that one smile couldn't cover. I'd find myself left out of meetings that mattered. I'd hand off a proposal and it would come back with someone else's name at the top. Little things at first, a missing invite, an unexplained redirect that pile up until they weigh a person down. When I asked him about those moments, he'd give me something that sounded like an apology and felt like a delay. We're pivoting, he'd say. We need a different face for this. Or you're tied up on operations, let me handle investors. The more he spoke, the less I got. Praise became a substitute for payment. Charm became a buffer against accountability. I kept pushing because I believed our deal was still alive. That someday the handshake would move to a signed sheet and my name would stop sitting in the shadow of his. I kept the receipts and the contracts in a drawer like a man who half expected trouble but hoped he'd never need them. I wrote down dates and versions and who had agreed to what in emails that smelled faintly of midnight coffee. I did it because I was practical, because loyalty didn't mean handing over your life without keeping a record of what you gave. When the big clients started asking to deal directly with him, I chalked it up to his charisma. When the work I created showed up under someone else's banner, I chalked it up to the fast pace. Each excuse was a small paper towel over a leak that kept getting bigger. People ask why I didn't confront him sooner, why I didn't storm his office and demand fairness. Confrontations are theater, they feel good in the moment but they rarely change contracts. I tried to talk subtly at first, then bluntly when the forwarding emails appeared. He'd smile and tell me to be patient. You'll see, he promised. I heard that promise and I remember feeling it as a future currency I could save. That's where I made my choice. I would keep working, keep the lights on, but I would also start preparing for the day words failed me. When the day finally came that HR handed me that keyring and asked for everything, I didn't feel betrayed in a sudden flash. I felt the slow burn of all those missed promises coming due. I had been the engine long enough to know how a machine dies when the fuel is cut. I had also made sure I had notes on where the fuel pipes were. In the end, I didn't want to wreck him. I just wanted to stop pouring my effort into a hole that someone else kept digging. The stab didn't come with a shout. It was a forwarded email that landed in my inbox like a dropped coin, small, ordinary, and heavy. I'm a man who reads everything, so when the subject line flashed, I opened it without thinking. Inside was a single sentence that felt like someone had nicked the air out of the room. Cut him out. Too expensive. He'll take a small exit. It was business as usual on the surface, but underneath it stripped years down to a line item. Betrayal had come in soft steps long before that email. I noticed the first omits like an ache. Meetings I wasn't invited to, doors closed an inch earlier than before, introductions that ended with someone else's handshake. I wrote proposals that later had new names attached, clients who stopped calling me and started calling him. Each tiny cut didn't hurt much by itself, but they added up. They looked like accidents until that forwarded message made them a pattern with a source. When I saw that line, I didn't flip a table. I didn't storm the office and make a mess. I archived the email and breathed. Anger, I learned, is best used with a map, not a furnace. I knew how to plan. I went home that night and opened the folders I kept because practical men keep evidence the way carpenters keep extra screws. Leases, invoices, vendor letters, everything went under the light on my kitchen table. I made lists and timelines. I traced signatures and phone logs and the small favors that had been turned into unpaid bills. People always ask how I kept it together while I was working 2 jobs at the same company, one official, one invisible. The invisible job was keeping the place running. I called the cleaners, I chased vendors, I paid the emergency electrician from my card when a server room overheated. I logged every call. I kept the receipts. Those little acts of maintenance were the real ledger, the stuff that kept the front man looking like a king when the plumbing was what made the castle livable. I started to move like I had all the time in the world because planning needs calm, not drama. I set up accounts to track payments, labeled emails by date and consequence, and printed every contract where his name sat above mine on the page of promise. I found clauses nobody read, signatures that tied him to leases, vendor agreements that named me as the on-call manager. He'd been the showman, the one who could charm the room into silence. I'd been the one who read the small type and fixed the leaks. Those documents were my map out of a game he thought he controlled. There were nights when I replayed the first handshake and the slow drift into exclusion. I asked myself if I had been naive, if loyalty had blinded me. Sometimes the answer was yes, but the more useful question was what to do next. I didn't want to burn everything. I wanted the company to stand on its own without me pretending his promises counted as stability. So I planned to remove the scaffolding I had been holding up without warning anyone. That felt fairer than a dramatic collapse and cleaner than a row at his desk. I moved quietly. When HR read the script to me and asked for company property, I placed the keys on the table and let my fingers rest there a second longer than they expected. I walked past his office like a man with pockets full of proof and nothing to prove. I called the property manager and reminded her of late payments and Elise's fine print she'd been told to ignore. I watched as legal steps took their measured course. The eviction notice was a small, precise thing. No fireworks, just a fact that would not be wished away. In the end, the forwarded email was the spark, but my plan was the slow burn that followed. I didn't act like a villain. I acted like a man who had been used as a cushion and finally refused to soften the fall. When the notice went up on his door and his phone rang with the sound of a life unraveling, I sat with the knowledge that I had done everything I could to make this clean. I hadn't wanted to destroy him. I wanted only to stop being his safety net. That decision, made over weeks and files and late nights, felt like the truest thing I had done in a long time. For weeks I lived in the company's legal folder like a ghost in the machine, turning pages under the kitchen lamp and marking dates with a pencil. I'm a man who likes to know where a thing ends, so I traced lease timelines and property records the way some men trace a family tree. I read insurance writers that used words nobody used in ordinary sentences, vendor agreements spelled out in legal small talk, and every contract that carried Mark's scrawl. He was the face, I was the hands. That separation had been our truth for years. Mark performed for stakeholders and cameras and whatever mirrors he stood in front of, but he never sat with the details. He liked the fireworks and the applause, the part where people leaned in. I liked the late-night emails that solved who owed what and when, and the quiet conversations with lawyers when clauses needed untangling. So when I dug into the files, I was not startled to find a mess. I was patient, which is a different kind of power. I read slowly, and I pinned every discrepancy to a date like a mapmaker marking dangerous roads. "You sure you want to turn all that up?" my brother friend asked when I described what I was doing. He lives a few towns over and listens like a man who's seen people burn bridges and thought it dramatic but necessary. "If he's built it on smoke and mirrors, pulling the thread might do worse than you think," he said. I told him I knew the risk. He shrugged and said, "Then know your exits." That was good advice, and I wrote it down beside the lease references. What I found first were small things: who signed for the cleaning service, who handled the alarm permits. Small facts, easy to miss. Then I got to the building. The office tower he loved to show off on investor decks turned out not to be corporate property. It sat on a long-term lease, a big number that looked respectable until you read the clauses. The lease listed conditions about default and notice, and most important, named the primary operational contact who would receive any official correspondence. The name listed was mine. I remember the chill when I read that line. Not because I felt danger, but because I saw leverage the way a locksmith sees a lock. All notices, all official mail, transfer of keys, insurance demands, parking disputes were routed to my desk. Mark trusted me with boots-on-the-ground responsibilities, the kind that make a place run when the front man is off selling visions. He thought of me as reliable and invisible. He never realized that those details could be a hinge. I called the property manager, a woman with a direct voice who had been patient with deferred checks and polite reminders. "We're up to date on rents," she told me at first, the practiced lie people tell when they want to keep windows open. I read her the exact dates and payments and showed her emails where promises were made and missed. She didn't argue when I mentioned the lease defaults and the clauses nobody at the top had read. "We need something signed," she said. "OSHA notices, insurance writers, they all go to the operational contact." She used the phrase like a key, and I could hear the metal turn. That night I sat at my table with the printed lease and the vendor agreement spread out like a floor plan. I didn't smile, I didn't dance, I planned. There are lines you don't cross when you're making moves that affect more than one life, but you also don't let a man stand on a house someone else is paying for. I made calls that felt procedural and clinical. I confirmed dates and recorded names and filed every reference in duplicate. People asked me later how I could hold onto calm through all that paperwork. The answer was simple: details do not panic, facts are patient. When you've been the one to call the emergency plumber at 2 in the morning, you learn to keep invoices and the number for the guy who shows up. Those little things become proof of who carried the day-to-day burden and who collected the praise. I wasn't trying to build a trap. I was making sure the story matched the receipts. Mark's world was glossy and designed for pictures. Mine smelled faintly of copier toner and coffee, and it held the sort of things that make a building exist. When I put those things together, the picture changed. The lease sat like an unassailable fact. The operational contact named me, and that meant notices would come through my desk. That simple bookkeeping line was a lever. I tested it quietly, making sure filings were current and timelines accurate. If a man builds an empire on promises and you hold the paperwork that keeps it standing, you don't need to shout. You need to press the right button and wait. The day they told me to leave felt like watching a slow train arrive. Human resources read the script with that clinical flatness they've had drilled into them. I'm a man. I put the heavy keyring down on the table like it was a cheap coin and let my fingertips rest on it for a beat longer than anyone expected. They asked for company items and checked boxes. Mark stood behind his glass wall and looked everywhere but at me, like a man afraid of seeing the thing he'd ignored for years. You understand the process, the HR woman said, voice steady, hands folded as if she could iron out awkwardness. I nodded because argument wouldn't change the facts on their paper. I gave them the visible stuff: keys, company laptop, the badge, and kept the other things in my head where paperwork lived. Possession is not the same as power, I thought, and I placed the keys down with a small, careful smile that nobody saw as anything but tired courtesy. As I walked past his office, I saw the board members peeking at their phones, curious about the theater they had paid to see. Mark mouthed something that might have been an apology once, but the sound died like a bird in the glass. I got to my car slowly and sat for a minute like a man gathering weather. Then I dialed the number I knew by memory because I had been the one fixing the leaks. The building's manager, the woman who took the calls when the lights went out and booked electricians at midnight. She answered on the second ring. "This is property manager," she said, no small talk, just the tones of someone who has learned how to keep a building standing by being blunt. I told her my name and why I was calling. "You're still listed as the operational contact on the lease," I said, and her voice changed in a way that told me I had her attention. "There's been missed rent, deferred maintenance. I handled a bunch of it to keep the office open." She asked me for dates and details like a professional taking notes for a case. I reminded her of the times I'd wired money from my own account to cover an urgent repair or had stayed late to sign a vendor's check because Mark had someone else handling it. I didn't confess pride, I simply laid out the facts. She was tired of broken promises, she told me. "We can't keep discounting the whole building because he writes speeches well," she said. She said the words like a verdict and then asked if I wanted to file notices. I told her yes. She moved with a speed that surprised me. Within the week, she had the eviction filings prepared, stamped, and recorded. It felt almost mechanical, efficient, and oddly fair. I'd spent months tracing deadlines and payments. She made the legal steps precise. "We post notices at closing time tomorrow," she said, as if she were announcing a routine. I thought about Mark's smile in investor decks and how a building's status is louder than a man's promises when the paperwork speaks. I didn't gloat. I made calls that were clinical and necessary, an attorney I trusted to confirm filings, a vendor to stop delivering equipment until accounts settled, and a colleague who could explain the operational handover without causing panic. I told the lawyer what I'd done and why, and he asked, "You saw the lease?" I said I had. He said, "Good, be precise and don't rush. Facts are cleaner than revenge." I wired him the scanned copies and slept like a man with a plan, not like a man who had won something cruel. When the notice went up on Mark's door the next afternoon, people didn't gasp in slow motion. They read and passed phones and looked at each other in that small office way when they see the script change. Mark tried to call me. His voice sounded like someone hitting glass. "Why would you do this?" he demanded. I told him simply that I had stopped covering for a debt he chose to ignore. He shouted and begged and made deals that would have looked good on a stage. I let him talk until the sound of his argument grew tinny and useless. After the call, I sat alone in my kitchen under the same lamp I'd used for weeks of paperwork and felt a calm I hadn't expected. I had handed over physical things earlier that day, the easy items, but I had kept what mattered: proof and patience. The eviction filings were not a punch. They were the natural consequence of the ledger finally getting read aloud. I didn't break a company. I stopped being the man who towels off someone else's mess. That distinction kept me awake and made the next morning quieter than I thought it would be. I timed it so the notice would appear on his door the same afternoon HR walked me out, because timing can feel like fate when you want the truth to land with force. I'm a man who plans, and I had planned every step until it felt inevitable. When they asked for company items, I gave them what they could see and nothing more. Then I watched the clock until the building manager posted the small official paper on his glass. It sat there under the light, simple and bureaucratic, and it said what 1,000 speeches never could. A few hours later my phone rang and it was him, Mark, breathless and furious, the suit that usually smoothed his voice gone. "Why is there an eviction notice taped to my door?" he shouted into the line. He sounded like a man who had just been told the curtain was up and the audience was laughing. I let the line sit like a taut wire between us and listened while he unraveled the way a wool sweater comes apart if you pull a loose thread. "You knew," he accused, the sentence sharp as glass. "He needed a villain and he picked me because it fit his story of a loyal lieutenant turned traitor. You knew all this would happen." I heard the board moving in the background, chairs scraping and low voices replacing the hum of confidence. "You sabotaged me," he said, trying the old trick of blame that used to get him out of tight corners. "Yes," I said, my voice was steady and low like someone reading an account aloud. "I knew." I didn't shout or hunt for drama. I kept my words tight and clear because facts are cleaner when they're not shouted. "You sabotaged yourself," I told him, and it landed differently than a curse. It sounded like a final thing said at a kitchen table after the bills are counted and there's nothing left to argue. He tried to turn it to reach back to the charisma that had built him a following. "You set me up," he insisted. "You timed it." The old man who could charm investors was there for a moment, bargaining with history. I let him talk. I had listened to his rehearsed apologies and clever pivots for years. I'd learned they were glossy shells over empty promises. This time the shell lay open and you could see nothing behind it. "I didn't set you up," I told him. My hand was on the steering wheel and the city moved around me without caring. "I stopped setting you up." I had been the thing that smoothed his falls for years, paying vendors, signing receipts, answering late calls. I had been the mattress beneath a man who liked to jump from stage to stage. People who cushion others eventually become the only thing underfoot, and then they get asked to vanish. There was a long quiet on the line, and in that quiet you could hear everything you couldn't see. Chairs creaked in a room that had been too loud with applause for too long. Phones were unlocked and eyes flicked to messages and to the single sheet on the door that said an address no longer belonged to the company. The silence felt heavy and close, like a crowd holding its breath before a verdict. I pictured him standing in his suite, hands flat on the glass, watching the ripple he'd made finally hit shore. He begged, he shouted, he tried the old lines that had once bent people in his direction. "Call them," he pleaded at one point. "Tell them this is a mistake, tell them you were confused." I heard the words as if through cotton. He wanted me to be the man who would tidy the mess and let him keep smiling. That had been my old job, clean up, nod, and keep the machine running. I had done it until the ledger said otherwise and the receipts no longer matched the story on stage. I told him no. "I won't lie for you anymore," I said. "I won't be the buffer that keeps people from seeing how thin your stage is." The call ended with the sound of him hanging up hard and the phone clicking into silence like a trapdoor shutting. I breathed and the air felt normal again, as if I'd paused a play in mid-act and stepped outside for a breath that wasn't scripted. Afterward, I sat in my car and let everything settle. Some friends call it cold, others call it necessary. I call it finishing a task I started for practical reasons, not spite. I had been loyal because I believed in a shared future. I stopped when I saw the future was a presentation he'd use while others paid the real cost. Standing there, I felt a clarity I hadn't expected, a feeling like a room finally holding only the furniture that belongs in it. The rest was noise, and it had to go. I pictured him pressed against his glass, the white square of paper taped to the door like a small, undeniable verdict people could read from the hall. I'm a man who pays attention to scenes, how light hits a face, how posture changes when someone knows the curtain's been pulled back. He'd always been the showman, the one who could make investors lean forward and make staff forgive a missed deadline. Watching that confidence fold, slowly and where others could see it, felt like watching a puppet finally lose its strings. For years I carried his projects the way a dock worker carries boxes, one after another, steady and careful. I fixed the things he left unfinished, smoothed over the problems he thought would go away, and let the company look polished while the foundation was quietly rotting. "We owe him credit," people used to say, and I'd nod and take another late call. The most valuable thing I ever gave him wasn't some title or a signature, it was my discretion and my labor. I kept secrets that would have wrecked careers, and I took calls at odd hours so meetings could proceed on schedule. That kind of work doesn't get a photo on a slide deck, but it keeps a company breathing. When I decided to stop, I didn't imagine fireworks. I imagined quiet facts doing their heavy work. I pulled my hands from the scaffolding and let the structure find its own balance. "You didn't have to do this," he said on the phone, voice smaller than I remembered. I answered, "No, I didn't. I chose not to anymore." It wasn't cruelty. It was a decision about fairness and about where I would put my effort. I had kept the machine running long enough to know which bolts were loose. Not propping it up felt like the only honest option left. I didn't gloat when the cards fell. I sat back and watched, because truth doesn't need a trumpet. People who had trusted him began to look at the papers I'd quietly kept. Vendors who'd accepted late checks called their accounts and asked for real terms. Staff who had whispered about missed raises now had something solid to point to. The house of cards didn't collapse with a crash so much as it rearranged itself into a pile that showed exactly how it had been built. I felt no triumph in that sight, only a steadiness I hadn't known for months. I'd given what I could, and then I stopped being the cushion that softened his falls. The rest was consequence, and consequences are a kind of truth that shows itself whether you cheer or not. People ask me later if all that quiet work and stubborn patience was worth one brief awful moment when he saw the notice and everything toppled. I'm a man who believes in plain answers, so I tell them straight, I didn't set out to burn him down. I stopped being the thing that kept his story on its feet. That difference matters. It's not revenge in the classic movie sense. It's refusal. Did you enjoy it? My brother friend asked me the week after. He sat across from me with a coffee and a look that wanted the messy truth. No, I said. I felt relieved. Relief, not glee. I'd spent years fixing what broke, answering calls at midnight, agreeing to moves that made his show look seamless. People like that expect a net. I was the net. When I pulled my hands away, the fall was not my doing alone. It was the effect of a weight no one had measured properly. I tell them how I plan the timing because people need context, not to gloat. You can plan for legal steps and deadlines and the posting of a notice, but you can't plan the exact sound a man's voice makes when his performance stops working on him. Mark called and his voice was smaller than the confident man on stage. Why would you do this? He asked like a child asking for a lost toy. I told him because I stopped covering for your choices. He had no comeback for that. That silence said what polite meetings never had the courage to. I didn't enjoy the collapse. I watched people I'd worked beside for years scramble for arrangements and explanations. I called a few of them afterward and said, I didn't want this to be messy. Some forgave me, some didn't. I tried to be honest and clear with staff and vendors because secrecy was the thing that let his show run. Once the curtains were open, a lot of work had to be done that night on small practical things. Who pays what, who takes over what, how to keep lights on. Planning had been my shield and my homework. Those details didn't feel poetic, they felt necessary. When people ask if I felt like a villain, I tell them no. I tell them the truth that looks ugly when you first hear it. Sometimes doing the right thing for yourself means other people get to learn the hard lesson about whom to trust. I didn't engineer a catastrophe to punish him. I removed the steady hands he had come to expect would lift him whenever he fooled around with the books of his life. People confuse taking away support with malice. There's a line. I tried to stay on the right side of it. There were practical steps I kept taking after the notice posted. I worked with the property manager to make sure the filings were legal and clean. I helped vendors who needed invoices clarified so they could be paid correctly. I offered staff referrals and helped as many people as I could to transition. That's not heroic. It's the sort of thing a man does when he's been holding the weight for others and refuses to let people be stranded for want of paperwork. I wanted the fallout to be about accountability, not about punishment. Friends ask whether I lost sleep over his ruin. I answer honestly, some nights were heavy. I thought about the choices that led us there and whether I could have done something sooner without becoming the loud person yelling at a stage. But mostly I slept because I had stopped lying by omission. There's a peace in looking at a set of facts and letting them be what they are without propping them up with your silence. In the end, the house of cards fell because the structure had been weak for a long time. My pulling my hands away simply exposed that weakness where everyone could finally see it. If that made him uncomfortable, that was the cost of a life built to look good at a glance and not hold up under inspection. I didn't destroy him out of spite. I stopped being his safety net and I made sure he felt the weight of what he had been asking others to carry. That was enough for me. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below, I'd love to hear your thoughts.